Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Penn from thecreativepenn.com and today I'm interviewing Jesse Karjalainen, which is very hard to say. Jesse is a writer, journalist, sub-editor and photographer, and he's also the author of The Joy of English. So today we're talking about language and grammar. So welcome, Jesse.
Hi, Joanna. Nice to finally be on your show. I've been looking forward to this.
No, it's great to have you on. So why don't you start by telling us a bit about where does your passion come from for the English language, and what made you write a book about grammar?
Well, I think I've got an Australian background. I came to the UK to study journalism, not directly, but in the end. But I think it was probably one of the case of, when you pull a thread and you keep pulling it. It was sort of coming to the UK and discovering certain meanings and expressions and different, grammar, different prepositions even, of what I thought was the same language. And I was like, oh, that's a bit weird. Why do they say that? So I kind of started looking into it while I was a student and, just kept sort of compiling and, buying different books. And I've become addicted to, different books on usage and grammar and all that kind of stuff. That was probably the first step. And then the second step was I got a job working for a publisher as an editor. So it was part of the job requirement to keep digging and keep finding out more. And obviously as I worked in the job, that was partly where the book then came from, was just seeing the same sort of things creeping into people's texts, over and over again. And I thought, well, hey, why don't, there's no book like that. Why don't I sort of compile my best of, sort of, and put that into a book? So that was the idea.
Fantastic. So I've got to ask you, because I'm not massively into grammar. What do you say to people who might find this topic a little bit boring?
Well, that's the other premise, of the book was it's actually, and the reason why obviously I called it The Joy of English is it's not a grammar book. It's a book about English usage and ways to improve it. And I think the best analogy, I'm very fond of analogies. I think one of the best analogies is you've bought your mother, your grandmother a computer and they want to learn how to use it. You don't go and buy them a book about programming, grammar. You go and buy them a book about how to use the programs, how to send an email, how to surf the internet, how to update your software and do all the fun things that you want to do, not the back-end stuff, programming, C++, active JavaScript, all that kind of stuff. So I kind of make the analogy that grammar, and I think that's where a lot of people go wrong. They think, I need to improve my English. Well, I'll go and buy a grammar book. But they go out and they buy exactly that, a book about grammar, programming, and then find, oh, it's not really for me. It's a bit boring. Rather than a book on English usage. And I think that's, part of maybe the misunderstanding a lot of people have is that grammar is what they need to fix, but it's not necessarily that. It's more the nuts and bolts and the everyday. I mean, if we speak English, you already know the grammar intuitively. You might not know the grammatical terms, but what I've done is focus on the little bits, where we can, things that we thought we knew or we've always wanted to know, didn't know where to turn to, and where a grammar book necessarily wasn't going to give you what you wanted. So, yeah, that was the idea.
Okay, and then I went directly to the chapter on the word very, because I know I overuse that word, and I'll be interested in you explaining a bit about that for the listeners. What's wrong with very and what do we need to do with it?
Okay, well, the first chapter, the opening chapter of the book, is focus on the word very, and it just happens to be that very is probably, I think I can't remember the exact words, but very is one of the most overused words probably in the English language, apart from maybe nice. No one wants to be called nice, but we use it all the time. It's one of those things that, very becomes ingrained and almost sort of robotic. So we use it without thinking, really, and I think I call it an empty calorie of a word that really doesn't add anything to what we're trying to say. So, for example, I bought a very large car, so it was, well, you can take out the word very, and say, I bought a large car, it's still a large car. So you could say, well, but I mean a very large car, not just large, very large. But then what that kind of shows is, well, maybe you need another word, like enormous car, and things like that. So it's one of those words that basically, when you're editing people's work, it just comes up all the time. You can take it out, and probably 99% of the time, there's no change in meaning.
No, interesting. And I actually did this. I went back through my manuscript and I got rid of every single very because of your book.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are one or two where it's certainly, fine to use it. For instance, like, I was born in this very house. You're not describing the house as very something. It's this very house. So obviously, if you delete every instance, you might change certain sentences like that in your text. But of course, when you're describing something as very large or very small or very round or very something, obviously, like you said, yeah, you can take it out and it won't change. It'll just mean you've got a tighter sentence, really.
Nice.
But it's interesting that you say that, because it is the chapter that a lot of people have said to me, oh, wow, like that, without knowing, and this is where we get back to the subject of grammar. It's got nothing to do with grammar. It's got nothing to do with how intellectual you are. It's something that everyone connect with, and it's funny that you say that, because I'm getting that from a lot of people. So I'm glad, I'm glad you like that.
It's a very good tip.
It's a very good tip.
Yeah. The other thing I was interested in is, and maybe this comes back to your misinformation, with the words and but, and starting a sentence with one of those words, you say that it's actually okay. Is that true? And why is that? Because we've all been told something different.
Yeah, I think again, it's one of those things that people have just heard. Surprising, a lot of people told me it's the school teacher who's told them that. But I think, I don't know where it comes from. But, and again, this is part of where I came from, looking, finding out why and looking. And all the books that I've read say that, well, there's nothing wrong with it. And to put it in a simple way, as I describe in the book, and but belong to a class of words. Or what have I written down? So I've got if, while, although, as, and since. They're all the same type of word, and but. They're all conjunctions. So if you can start a sentence with if, while, although, as, since, why can't you start a sentence with and or but?
No, good point. Again.
Yeah. And, so again, when you start looking into these things, you discover, well, it's not really true. And the only thing I can think of is why perhaps the teacher would have been saying that would be, you can certainly overuse. If you start every sentence with and every sentence with but, it gets a bit tedious. And perhaps that's what they were trying to, instill. But unfortunately, it sort of has gone overdrive. And people are, afraid to use it because they think it's somehow wrong. But, by all means, go for it.
No, that's good to know. And I don't think I do start things with and very often, because that just doesn't. But I use but definitely, and it's good. I was definitely more aware on my last read through of these things, so it's good to know. You also talk in the book about a model sentence, and I wondered if you could possibly explain that, and also about sentence fragments and the importance of both of those things.
Okay. Well, one of my other chapters, of which there are 100, is the model sentence, as I call it, and I give the example of somebody did something. And I think probably the best way, again, what I've tried to do in the book is describe things without using grammatical terms. Without, obviously, there are plenty of books about grammar, but to explain it in a way that people can relate to, that's not going to put them to sleep. A model sentence, somebody did something. For a start, it's active, which was one of your other questions. But if we think the famous phrase, curiosity killed the cat, that's somebody did something. And the habit which I'm trying to break is to break the cycle where a lot of people do, the cat was killed by curiosity, which is not somebody did something, it's more something happened to somebody. Or and it becomes passive. So another example that you quite often you might read in business literature or corporate, websites or something is, the event was hosted by the president.
Mm.
So you're putting the president last, but you're really talking about the president, but you mention him last, and you could have a really long sentence. The event held at so-and-so, blah, 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 was hosted by the president. But you could turn it around and make it active, make it somebody did something, so the president hosted the event.
Mm.
And what that does is sort of make your words, streamlined and give them a bit of punch, and it sets a good example. So somebody did something. So try and keep that in your mind. There's a second part to your question. I can't remember now.
Sentence fragments, which some authors use quite a lot.
Exactly. Well, this is something, again, I think, because I studied journalism at university, that was my, my degree. I grew up as a child, like probably most people, wanting to be a writer, and, they all say you have to read to understand and all that kind of stuff. And, I probably hate to admit this, but when I was a kid, my favorite author was Tom Clancy. I don't know if you've ever read a Tom Clancy novel, but
absolutely.
Yeah. So one thing you see, if you try and look at the way he writes, it's very fragmented. There's loads of clauses, loads of commas, loads of, and I, when I was younger, I thought, oh, that's how you write. He's sold millions. He must know what he's doing. That must be the model to emulate. Mm. But then when I went to university to study journalism, we were taught. I distinctly remember, probably on day 2 or 3, one of my the lecturers said that if there's more than, what was it? Actually, I don't distinctly remember. Basically, to do with commas. If you've got more than 2 commas, it needs to be rewritten.
Mm.
But ideally, try and write it without any commas. Because again, what you're doing is by shifting things around, is like the horse and the cart. You're putting the cart in front of the horse, but you're really talking about the horse, but you're describing the cart first, even though you really want to talk about what the horse did rather than what the cart looks like. It all becomes complicated, and I guess the trick of journalism is to be clear.
Yeah, and that's okay. So I have a question on that then.
So that comes back to basically an ideal sentence. Be as clear as you can, be as straightforward as you can, and help the reader by just being concise and sort of linear in your approach.
And I have business writing background, I guess, so I do try and make my sentences like that, similar to journalism. But I recently bought Umberto Eco's latest book, The Prague Cemetery. Obviously, you're familiar with him, but his opening sentence of the book, it was literally half a page long.
Wow.
So what is this? Does literary fiction have some kind of long sentence issue? Or it is, like you mentioned Tom Clancy, he seemed to have that too? Or is it a modern writing? Or, when are these long sentences acceptable?
I think, acceptable, there's acceptance and there's taste. I'm not going to make a judgment either way necessarily. I think it's more about preference, I prefer to read a certain style of book, a certain, narrative, a certain way, and I'm not personally particularly fond of largely, flowery language and descriptive. I'm more, personally, again, I prefer where something happens, and there's a really exciting story, like, Stieg Larsson, I couldn't put it down, but Umberto Eco, writes a different style of book. It's not necessarily unputdownable. It's maybe the kind of thing that you want to savor the words, and and I think there's, it's good to be clear in your mind, why you want to write in a particular way, or who you're writing for, because obviously, if Umberto Eco and Tom Clancy started working together, I could see there being quite a strange book coming out of that, if you get my point.
Oh, definitely. No, you're right, and I think saying it's preference is a good thing. But I certainly had to read this first page so many times to try and get the meaning from it. So definitely a personal preference.
It's exactly the point about, are you doing your own reader? If as a writer, as an author, you want people to like your writing. And if you're making it hard for them, scratching their head and at the end of the day, writing, like speaking, is communicating. It's getting your idea from your mind into the mind of another person, and why not make it easy for them, make it enjoyable rather than chore.
Yeah, and the other thing that crossed my mind was at writers' festivals, people are always asked to read passages from their own books. And I can't even imagine how you could read that passage out loud. And I think people should keep that in their minds, when you read it out loud, can you actually do it without taking a breath, or take a breath with a comma?
And you'd probably need some practice.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so I guess we've talked a bit about the writing actively, but I also wanted to ask you about the American versus English thing, because I struggle with this. I am English, and my natural inclination is to write English,
yep.
But because my blog audience is mostly American and I write my books for a mainly American audience, I try and use American English. So is there a correct way, and what do you think about this American versus British thing?
Well, I'm actually personally quite fascinated with the differences. Again, coming from Australia, where, as you know, you live there yourself. But in Australia, you've got almost like a hybrid between American and British, because you've got a lot of, the spellings are British for the most part, but a lot of the vocabulary is very Americanized. So there's almost like three models there. But strictly American and British, I think. Well, obviously, if your readers are American, your audience is American, then that would be, you're doing the right thing, because But I think the only thing to be aware of is that you kind of have to pick sides. There's no middle ground between I'm going a little bit American here and a little bit British here, or because not that it's necessarily wrong. Again, I'm coming back to the making it easy for the reader, and you want them to read your writing, appreciate and understand what you're trying to say, rather than go, hey, sidewalk. I mean, you don't want them to stop mid-sentence and go, oh, but for instance, in your case, they might go, oh, I thought she was American. But you may have used a word that was British and, distinct to Britain, that they've never heard of. And then you suddenly stop them going, oh, hang on, what's going on? Do you see what I mean? It makes sense to write for your audience, but there are a lot more difference. There is rather a lot more difference between British and American English than people appreciate.
And it's one of my tips for that is to make sure you have an editor or a beta reader who is in the country you're aiming for, because they pick up these things, don't they?
Exactly. And okay, so what have we got differences? It's not just color and flavor and the honor and things like that, and the odd comma here. You've got a whole raft of spelling classes. I think there's probably something like 40 different classes of spelling differences, not just words, classes of word. You've got spelling, punctuation, different prepositional uses, different vocabulary, all sorts of things. And if you don't know these things and you're writing in someone else's language, it might, come, to your reader's mind that you're going, oh, that's a bit weird, or that doesn't sound, it doesn't ring true, if you know what I mean, if it's not coming. So absolutely, have an American editor or somebody helping you, if that they can pick those little things out, or at least will, slow the reader's mind down and distract them.
Yeah. So funny that you pick up on these things. I mean, do you find yourself being hyper aware of all of this stuff in daily life? Are you like that woman Lynn Truss, who did the Eat, Shoots and Leaves, who was forever pointing out signs and things? Do you find yourself doing that?
Probably more so because I'm from the editing side of things, because you're constantly reading, all sorts of writing from, flyers and magazines and books and articles and websites, and it sort of just becomes an innate thing that, you go to a restaurant on a romantic date and you can't help looking at the menu going, oh my God. Someone needs to take a look at this menu before we get the food sorted.
It's funny you say that as well, because the TV program Fringe.
Yep.
And they have these signs, the name of the place above everywhere, in these big letters on top of the program. And I've spotted so many spelling mistakes in there, and I'm always going, "Oh, that's so annoying."
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could look at it from another point of view, is that obviously not everyone has an innate sort of, are able to see these things, You could look at it something like, typography. I know a lot of people like to make their own covers, and the designs and things like that. And people say, oh, is it worth, paying a graphic designer to design my book? And I would say absolutely yes, because...
Me too.
What is it that someone with an experienced eye for typography, legibility and kerning and spacing and all that kind of typographical elements, that you can look at a book and tell straight away that someone made that, who doesn't know what they're doing necessarily when it comes to typography. So I think language is similar. When you work with it every day, and it's your job to kind of pick up things, you will see them everywhere, but it's like once you've seen it, you can't help notice it. And it doesn't necessarily mean like Lynn Truss to beat people with a stick and say, I can't believe that you've done that, because at the end of the day, and again, that's probably part of the book, what I put in the book, there are loads of things in there that people will probably read like the very, no one ever told me, I never knew, I was never aware. But as soon as you've been pointed out, you will... you can't help but notice your berries. Yeah,
absolutely. Tenses are something else I'm interested in, because, as a writer and novelist now, you have to write in a certain point of view, and, often it's a third person, past tense, I guess. What do people get wrong with tenses?
Well, generally speaking, regardless of whether it's a novel or whether it's a press release or an email or a blog, I would say one of the most common things that, again, it happens, I come across this every day. You might have a sentence where someone writes, blah, 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 she said. And then you have a couple of paragraphs about something, and then you have another person in the story, and it's blah, 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 blah. He says. So in 4 paragraphs back you're saying said, and 4 paragraphs down you're saying said or says, and you're kind of mixing up the two without realizing it. I see that a lot. Again, it's about having a deliberate awareness of picking a side and saying, what am I doing today? So you might be writing a blog where you're doing it all in the present tense, and you might be writing a novel where it's all in the past tense. But to be clear in your mind which one you're doing and not jumble between the two, because you're only going to have to go back, or someone else will have to go back and rewrite it later on.
Yes, and editors are very important, everybody. Everybody needs an editor, that's for sure. Okay, so I also wanted to just ask you quickly about dialogue, and I guess we're very much taught about writing proper words, and I guess I notice very much with dialogue, you would say I'd instead of I had. But when people are writing, what I hate actually is reading dialogue where people do not speak like that. Or I would, rather than I'd or whatever. So I think that's elision. Is that elision when you run it together in dialogue?
Well, contraction is when you do I had into I'd.
Yeah.
So what you're basically doing is, for instance, there are words where it sounds unnatural. For instance, let's have coffee. Joanna, let us have coffee.
Yeah, but people write that because they think it's proper English.
Well, yeah. Again, I think it comes down to preference and taste, and above all, being consistent in what you're doing. On the other hand, I would also say that, again, it's probably more appropriate for a novel and for fiction than it is for something like, if you're doing a corporate even a community newsletter or something, you know. I know that in the non-fiction world, if we call it that, there is a preference to, you know, pull the words apart and keep, I had, you know, we can, you know, we cannot accept your proposal rather than can't. You know, there is a preference in the non-fiction world to not contract, but there's absolutely no reason why you can't do that in your own writing, you know, when it's non-fiction. But consistency is key, really.
Across everything, I guess. And but would you agree that the grammar and words of dialogue is quite different to the rest of the narrative?
Yeah, I think what you need to do again in your mind when you're writing, almost like you've got two types of writing. You've got the writing that you're producing, and then you've got the spoken dialogue. Now, obviously, I haven't written fiction as you have, but I do have an analogy again where you've got in a lot of journalism, you know, you have reported speech. So, you know, on the one hand, you are doing, as the writer, you're describing, telling, and then you're introducing quotes from people. So when you're using quoted material, or in your case dialogue, you're freer to sort of to loosen up the language and make it casual, and again just make it appropriate for the setting. You know, if you had you're doing a story about two teenagers, you know, down in the mean suburb somewhere, and they're let us go for a drink. You know, it's not going to ring true.
Brilliant. And so where can people find you and the book online?
Okay, well, in the UK, it's published by How To Books. They're in Oxford. So obviously bookshops, bookstores, but Amazon, you can always find it if you go to amazon.co.uk. If you go to my website as well, it's thejoyofelenglish.com. But I mean, Amazon's always a good bet. But again, if you're in the UK, don't forget support your local bookshops.
All right, well, thanks ever so much for your time, Jesse. That was great.
It's been lovely speaking to you again. I really enjoy your podcast, and I really glad I found you. So keep it up. Thank you.
Thank you.